Now we're going to get to the good part of the story. The other part of the story is just BS, I think. But here's the. I'm going to read you word for word. So he gave an opening statement to his newsroom, and his name is Dean Baquet or Baguet, and he's the super duper chief editor at the New York Times. And I'll just read to you real quick what he said. He says, "So we've had a couple of significant missteps. And I know you're concerned about that, and I am too, but there's something larger at play here. This is a really hard story." He repeats that over and over. This is a really hard story. Newsrooms haven't confronted one like this since the 1960s. I guess he's talking about the civil rights movement and racism and bigoted politicians. Is that what he's talking about, you think, Aaron?
Yeah, I assume so.
Okay, so then he goes, it got trickier after, we don't know what he said. It got trickier after blah, blah, went from being a story about whether the Trump campaign had colluded with Russia and obstruction of justice to being a more head-on story about the president's character. Okay. So what I read there is when he says it got trickier after it went from being a story about whether the Trump campaign had colluded with Russia and obstruction to being more head-on. So what it means is we're never going to talk about the real issues. We're going to talk about Russia. We'll talk about obstruction. And now we're going to talk about racism. But we're never going to talk about the real reason you got Donald Trump. That's what I make out of that. Do you have anything to say about that paragraph, Aaron?
Well, yeah, no, I totally agree. And this is why there's been this dangerous sort of revisionism when it comes to New York Times history. As you mentioned earlier, there's this idea that the New York Times has just been astray in the last couple of months because they didn't call Trump a racist. But the New York Times has been promoting and apologizing for militarist and racist policies for its entire existence. And Cory Booker saying that lives depend on you. Well, the New York Times has been used to destroy lives. That's what the New York Times is there for. It promoted the Iraq War. It promoted basically every single war. There's not one war that the U.S. has launched in the last, I don't know, say 40 decades, possibly ever, where the New York Times has not cheerleaded for it. Back when the Bush administration did a coup in Venezuela, 2002, the New York Times editorial saying that this is great. So that's what they do. So it's a dangerous illusion to pretend that the New York Times has lost its way just under Trump.
Okay, so well said, exactly right. He goes on to say, we built our newsroom to cover one story, and we did it truly well. Now we have to regroup and shift resources and emphasis to take on a different story. So the story that he built his newsroom to cover was Russiagate, correct, Aaron?
That's exactly right.
So now we have to regroup. Why do you think they have to regroup? Because Russiagate has been proven to be a hoax, or because it doesn't have any legs left?
Well, I'd say both. They hyped this story for over 2 years. That Trump. I mean, it's hard to remember now because now we're in a different era. We're in the post-collusion era now. But you remember for over 2 years, this is all the New York Times and MSNBC talked about, and they built this false impression that Trump had some illicit contacts with the Russian government, and that Mueller was closing in, and that this was a presidency in peril. They built up this totally false image, and then it came crashing down. It came crashing down when Mueller finished his investigation, didn't indict anybody for a Trump-Russia conspiracy, issued a report that found no Trump-Russia conspiracy, and then of course recently we had Mueller's testimony, where Mueller proved to be clueless about his own investigation. So every possible pillar of this stupid thing has come crashing down. And then, as Dean Baquet says, now they're caught flat-footed because they built their newsroom around this. And by the way, they didn't just build their newsroom to cover this story as if they're sort of dispassionate journalists searching for the truth. They built it to peddle it. And they did that through many things, by ignoring all the countervailing information that undermined the conspiracy theory, and all the information that tamped down this like crazy hysteria about Russia being attacking the U.S. with something akin to Pearl Harbor or 9/11. And the facts were all there. You and me covered it, but everyone else pretty much ignored it or peddled it. And they also peddled it by being a recipient of selective leaks from people in the intelligence community and in Congress, Adam Schiff most likely, who gave them stuff in a misleading way that created a false impression of there being something there when there wasn't. And it wasn't just giving them selective information. They also gave them straight up false information. And the New York Times hasn't been held to account for that yet. So, to go back to February 2017, New York Times published a story. It was crazy, and there's been no accountability for it yet. February 2017, and the headline is something like, Trump officials had contacts with senior Russian intelligence officials. And it was based on leaks from U.S. officials that they had caught the Trump campaign having contacts with senior Russian intelligence officials, giving this impression that, there was something illicit going on. And, Jim Comey denied that story months later, but the New York Times never retracted it. And the obvious thing the New York Times should have done there on top of retracting that story should have been, well, why was somebody telling us that there was high-level contacts between Trump and Russia? And if that was actually false, then why were they telling us that? But they refused to ask that basic question and instead let themselves be used to peddle disinformation and let themselves essentially be useful idiots. The same thing that people that you and I were accused of being when we challenged all this stuff. So, there's a lot for them to account for there.
And they never will. Okay. Correct. Okay. Let's keep going. Let's move on. He says so he ends that by saying that we have to shift resources and emphasis to take on a different story. I'd love your help with that. As Audra Birch said when I talked to her this weekend, this one is a story about what it means to be an American in 2019. It is a story that requires deep investigation into people who peddle hatred, but it is also a story that requires imaginative use of all of our muscles to write about race and class in a deeper way than we have in years. In the coming weeks, we'll be assigning some new people to politics who can offer different ways of looking at the world. Aaron, that is great news for you. I'm sure that Dean Baquet from the New York Times is going to hire someone who has a totally different view, who happened to be correct about Mueller and the Russiagate investigation. I'm sure he's going to call you up, or is he going to use just the same people who got everything 100% wrong?
Well, I am encouraged there to see him use the C word, class.
Huh.
Yeah.
I mean, how often do we hear somebody in mainstream politics or media
Never.
say the word class?
Never, ever.
When Bernie Sanders says it now, on the campaign trail, it's like, what? What is that word? Because that's the forbidden word. Because that word means looking at the fact that we actually have class in this country and that we have class war, But whether or not the New York Times, which has been an agent
of the class war
for decades, will now suddenly look at class in a serious, insightful way, I'm personally not very helpful. I mean, look at their op-ed page. It's the worst op-ed page in the world. It's like nothing but a series of apologists for U.S. violence and U.S. economic warfare on its own people and the people around the world. Thomas Friedman, Brett Stevens, David Brooks, on and on and on and on. It's basically right-wing white men. And the funniest thing was that you remember back when Trump was elected, we were told that one of the best things we could do to resist was to subscribe to the New York Times.
Yes.
Right? That was what we were supposed to do. And the New York Times rewarded us by hiring all these, right-wing hacks to be their op-ed columnists.
Yeah, they immediately hired
Stevens.
climate change deniers.
Yeah.
Barry Weiss.
Yes. Yeah.
Smugnerant Barry Weiss.
Yeah.
We'll also, he said, and then he goes on to say, we'll also ask reporters to write more deeply about the country, race, and other divisions. I really want your help in navigating this story. What I'm saying is that our readers and some of our staff cheer us when we take on Donald Trump, but they jeer at us when we take on Joe Biden. Oh, those pesky readers. Those pesky readers. So he's blaming their readers for their own. Of course, they're going to criticize us. That's your fault. That's kind of what he's doing there, right?
Yeah, and I mean, what is the point he's trying to make? Like, does that mean that they're not going to take on Joe Biden? That they're here not to be serious journalists, but they're here to basically take partisan sides? I hope that's not what he's saying.
Well, he goes on. The next sentence he says is, they sometimes, meaning their readers, they sometimes want us to pretend that he, Donald Trump, was not elected president. But he was elected president. And our job is to figure out why and how and to hold the administration to account. Okay, so you know that it's been 3 years since he's been elected, and you're just now trying to figure out why he got elected? 3 years? And I got news for you. It's not a Rubik's Cube on why he got elected. 40 years of the elite neoliberal class throwing workers overboard and fucking them right in their faces. Barack Obama comes back from public life and he takes $500,000 at a clip from banks. Yeah. They're doing it right in your face. They don't care. That's why we got Donald Trump. That's why. But I guarantee you every story the New York Times writes about why we got Donald Trump will be about racism, right?
Well, I think that's a pretty likely scenario. And it's interesting the reason we got Russiagate is because people like Dean Backett refused to do what he's now saying he wants to do now.
Yes.
As you're pointing out now, 3 years later, he wants to understand how it is that Donald Trump got elected. But it was a refusal to do that from the start, and that was a mentality laid down by the Clinton Democrats. And even though they lost to Donald Trump, the media marched in lockstep with them. And instead of doing an honest self-reflection about how it is that enough people were convinced to vote for Donald J. Trump, who portrayed himself as a working class champion and who spoke out against military intervention, all of which was a con. Instead of doing that, they decided to blame Russia for their loss. And the amazing thing is, at least Dean Backett is acknowledging reality somewhat now, but you still have people like Neera Tanden still blaming Susan Sarandon for Donald Trump's victory. Not the fact that
the Hillary Clinton campaign itself propped up Donald Trump with the Pied Pipe strike strategy, right?
Yeah. And that they refused to visit Wisconsin and Michigan, and that their candidate had no message. And to the extent they had a message, it was celebrating an economy that had left out, so many people across the country. So, it's great seeing at least that Dean Backett is somewhat acknowledging that the job of the New York Times is to figure out, such important things as how Donald Trump got elected president. But it's amazing, as you say, that we're hearing this now 3 years later, and we're only hearing it because the thing they latched onto, Russiagate, has totally collapsed, so it's just not sustainable anymore. And it's tough because obviously racism is a huge issue in this country. But the problem we have with outlets like the New York Times is they continue to use racism, and people in the Democratic Party, they use racism to avoid – they make it mutually exclusive. So they use racism to avoid talking about class. Kamala Harris, she gets cheered for talking about something Joe Biden did 40 years ago when he supported busing, which at this point now, I mean, sure, like that was a great moment, but that's not the dominant issue when it comes to racism now. And of course, racism and class are intertwined. But the way racism is covered now, so many outlets cover it in a way that it's basically used to make us not talk about class, and it's deemed to be mutually exclusive. And I don't have any high hopes that the New York Times will do anything different.
Boy, there's moments of our conversation. I feel like we're doing an episode of Democracy Now!, except it's not as boring.
Well, and also we're willing to acknowledge that Russiagate is bullshit.
Yes, and they're not. They're still not doing that at Democracy Now!?
They've kind of swept it under the rug. Basically, they drank the Kool-Aid, unfortunately, like everybody else. Their top guest on Russiagate was Marcy Wheeler, one of the foremost conspiracy theorists. And at a certain point, they have some sense. So at a certain point, I think they realized that it wasn't going the way that everyone thought it was going to go. So now I think they want us all to forget that they peddled it, but they did, and I'm certainly not going to let people forget it because I think it's important. Just as we're holding the New York Times to account, we should hold our progressive and adversarial journalists to account as well.
Yeah. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to hold people accountable. I don't know. I can make a video that says the New York Times sucks, but I can't hold them account. I can't hold people who did shitty work on Russiagate account because there's no punishment I can give them except wag my finger at them and say you guys were horrible. And it doesn't matter because they all got it wrong together. So there'll never be a price to pay, just like with Iraq War and WMDs and Libya and all that shit. They all get it. So if everybody's wrong, then nobody's wrong. If just like when George Bush said, nobody foresaw them flying planes into buildings. So if nobody foresaw it, then nobody's responsible, even though people, of course, foresaw that happening. Their own military saw that happening, and we had devised plans for it. Anyway, let me go a little bit more what Dean Baquette said. He says, this is hard stuff. Isn't it amazing, Ron, that it's so hard that we got it right? I already smoked pot today, and somehow I got it right more than the whole fucking New York Times. Not one guy, the whole New York Times. I got it righter, you got it righter, and fucking Aaron Matei got it righter.
They must have been tired there.
They must have been really tired.
They were kind of really busy making sure every headline had the
So
resistance
hard.
approval. It was tough. It was just hard.
Such a hard story. Such a hard story. Such a hard story that a Jagoff nightclub comedian got it right in his fucking garage for 3 years straight. Scooped you. That's how hard of a story it was. Such a hard story. Do you see why I have zero respect for fucking journalists? Zero. Such a hard story. You see why when I'm in a room full of them, I have to take anti-vomit medicine? No, Jimmy, you're not a journalist, right? That's what they say. I like to say, no, you're not a journalist. No, I'm not half as shitty as you are, if that's your question. No, I'm not as shitty as you are. So this is hard stuff. We're covering a president who lies and says outlandish things. First time. You guys no practice covering presidents who lie? This is the first time? First time, Aaron. First time.
Yeah.
Did your head almost explode when mine did when I read that? Oh, we're covering a dishonest president. Wow, who saw that coming?
Yeah. This is them basically using Trump to justify their servitude to power.
Yes.
Because if Trump is the only liar, then they can peddle the lies of every other liar in office before him, which is literally every single other president. Barack Obama lied plenty of times. He told us that we had to bomb Libya to prevent a genocide, which was bullshit. George W. Bush lied about Iraqi WMD. The New York Times led the pack in peddling that lie. Bill Clinton told a series of lies with all his bombings. When he bombed Iraq many times, crippled the country with genocidal sanctions. The New York Times ran cover for all of that. So this is the danger of Trump for people who actually care about journalism and actually care about holding power to account, is the way that lapdogs of power can use him to avoid holding to account everybody else.
So he goes on and says it should summon all of our, meaning the Trump administration, it should summon all of our resources and call upon all of our efforts to build a newsroom where diversity and open discussion is valued. So let me get this straight. You built a newsroom. You already built a newsroom where diversity and open discussions is not valued?
We forgot about that the first time.
Oh, fuck. We built this newsroom. We forgot to put in diversity of opinion.
That was item 12. Who missed that one?
Well, I guess I'll have to have another town hall in our newsroom to explain how we forgot to build in diversity and open discussions. So this is what they're doing. So now he says, we're gonna build a newsroom where diversity. It's as if they didn't have a paper before. Like they're just gonna start. They're starting from scratch to build a paper. Hey, do you think diversity and open discussion should be valued? You know what? Make a ballsy call and say yeah. What the fuck? Like he's really sticking his neck out saying that. Like that, to me, that's the dumbest thing he said in this whole thing. that we're going to build a newsroom. We're going to now, in 2019, build a newsroom where diversity and open discussions are valued. What the fuck? What
You
have
know
you
what?
been?
You know what he
What are you,
omits to say?
Breitbart?
He doesn't even include facts.
He doesn't even, that's right. He doesn't say facts. He doesn't say diversity, open discussion, and facts
Yeah, no,
are valued.
no.
Just diversity of opinions.
Being the head of a big outlet or a corporation, it's like you're on a constant apology tour and a constant promising to do better. You remember there was that wave of like Facebook ads saying, okay, we know we screwed up. But this time we got it.
Yeah. Yeah.
We heard you. We really did. And Uber, the same thing. They all do it. And this is the New York Times version of that. Okay, yeah. All right, we got it wrong. But now, I promise you.
So
We were a bit flat-footed, but we fixed it.
there's a tiny bit flat-footed.
But he's talking to a room full
Of
of
reporters.
journalists. What, so they all are sitting there believing this bullshit?
Yes. So here, real quick, this just comes right from his speech. And somehow Slate got a copy of it, and so they made a transcript of it. So this is what he said. This is what the super duper editor and chiefy chief from the New York Times said. He said, Chapter 1 of the story of Donald Trump, not only for our newsroom, but frankly for our readers was, did Donald Trump have untoward relations with the Russians, and was there obstruction of justice? So that's the Chapter 1. That was it. That was it. Not how we get here. How did this happen? Why? Who voted for him? Why didn't people come out and vote for Hillary? What? None of that. The only thing, Chapter 1. That was it. And by the way, our readers wanted to know it too, so we're not assholes. Is that what you get from that paragraph, Aaron?
Totally. And listen, Jimmy, I'll never stop laughing at what a farce this whole thing was. That line there, did Donald Trump have untoward relationships with the Russians? With the Russians, it's basically the intellectual equivalent of saying, did Donald Trump talk to Santa Claus? There really is no different, because if you even read the Mueller report, you see there that Mueller even has a line where, and we've talked about this, where Mueller is talking about the period after the election, and he says that the Russian government and top Russian elites want to make contact with the Trump administration. And Mueller goes, they appeared not to have any pre-existing contacts and struggled to make inroads with the new administration because there were no actual Trump-Russia contacts. So not only was there no conspiracy, they can't even find any contacts with anybody in the Trump orbit and anybody acting on behalf of the Kremlin, which is the kind of the basis for a conspiracy. But yet the people behind this, whoever they are in the Democratic Party, in the intelligence community, and in Congress, they conned everybody, including the New York Times, into believing into this Santa Claus-like fantasy. And instead of doing their jobs and applying minimal evidentiary scrutiny, they went full steam ahead. And that was left to, and I'm sorry to keep tooting our own horn, but again, you and I and a few others were some of the only ones to take the task of journalism and facts seriously. And
for that we were
Dean
called
is having the speech now.
And for that we were called conspiracy theorists and what else were we called? Some kind of peddlers.
We were called useful idiots.
Useful idiots. That's
Putin,
it.
Putin apologists.
Right.
Talk about the irony of calling us useful idiots. People saying that who were peddling the most idiotic conspiracy theory I've ever heard. And they won't admit it to this day that it was a stupid conspiracy theory that was evidence free. They'll go, look, people still today go, I saw under one of your tweets today, someone said, read the Mueller report to you. yeah.
To you.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's all in there. I guess we just don't put people in jail anymore for treason. I guess that's why. All right, so here's where it gets really good. So Chapter 1 was we had to cover Donald Trump. Is he a Russian agent and did he obstruct? Ready? That was a really hard story, you guys. Let's not forget, we set ourselves up to cover that story. I'm going to say it. We won 2 Pulitzer Prize covering that story. Which, if you had a shred of dignity, if your mother raised you right, you would give back right now. But guess what, Dean Baquette? You don't have integrity. You don't have dignity, which is why you got to be the editor of the New York fucking Times. That's why you're a servant of the oligarchs, which is how you got to be the super duper editor of the New York Times. You didn't get there because you're a rebel rouser telling the truth and uncovering the truth about our establishment. You got there because you're a servant of our establishment. And for you to say we won 2 Pulitzer Prize covering a bullshit story in a completely incorrect way, and you're bragging about it, again, if you had any integrity, you would give those Pulitzer Prizes back. But guess what, Aaron? They don't have any integrity. They don't have dignity at the New York Times. They don't. And that's not hyperbole. That's a fucking fact. This guy is admitting Russiagate is a bullshit story. We were wrong about it, but we won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Why? Because the establishment likes to give each other hand jobs. That's why. Can you get Aaron? Yeah. Why? Is that right, Aaron?
I totally agree. If they had any integrity, they would return those Pulitzer Prizes. Stories based partly on the Steele dossier, this bullshit collection of opposition research paid for by the Democrats, which mainstream outlets like the Times took seriously and investigated and tried to present as credible when they should have been pointing out that the whole thing was bullshit, just like all of Russiagate was bullshit. But yeah, they don't care about journalistic integrity in the way that, I don't know, people like us do, where journalistic integrity means being faithful to the facts and being faithful to the evidence and doing your basic job as a journalist. They peddled a fashionable narrative. And unfortunately, that problem and that dynamic goes way beyond the New York Times.
And guys like Chris Hayes will say, yes, we lied and pushed a false narrative, but we did it for the right reasons and against the right guy. That's what Chris Hayes says. I don't want to show you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, except the irony of it, of course, is that people like Chris Hayes, who portray themselves as being anti-Trump and who portray the Russia investigation as being anti-Trump, they don't have the intellectual honesty, and speaking of integrity, to acknowledge that Russiagate was a massive gift to Trump.
Right.
What better gift to Donald Trump, this person you're supposedly resisting, than to channel his resistance into a stupid conspiracy theory instead of his actual policies for 3 years, and then hand him a further gift when he becomes vindicated, when it all collapses. So people like Chris Hayes and everybody at MSNBC and the New York Times, they weren't just credulous people peddling a bullshit story. They were wrapping Trump's re-election present.
Yes. They weren't just being shitty reporters and stenographers to power. They were actively helping Trump get reelected.
Yep.
Yeah, but everybody will be angry at Susan Sarandon, correct?
Correct.
Correct.
Yeah.
So now I want to show you the most outrageous thing he wrote or said. So after he touts that they won 2 Pulitzer Prize covering Russiagate, he says at the bottom, and I think we covered that story better than anyone else. Aaron, I want to see your face. They covered it better than The Nation magazine, did they? Wasn't there? I thought there was a reporter at The Nation who actually got it super right and won an award for that. Did you hear about that guy?
Yeah, but unfortunately, the New York Times won't hear about that guy and others like you who covered accurately because, again, they don't operate in a world where journalistic integrity is paramount. I mean, for them, it's about access to power.
I used to think
peddling
that.
what is fashionable for power.
I used to think
that's
that.
what they're there for.
I used to. So you're half right. They are there for that reason, but to say that they'll never hear this is not true. They will hear this. They know who you are. They know who I am. And you know how I know they know who I am? They're fucking writing smear pieces about me right now. CNN did a smear piece about me. The Washington Post did a smear piece about me. Daily Beast is getting ready to write a smear piece about me. The fucking Guardian is right now. The fucking head of the Center for American Progress, the war criminal Nera Tandon, took time out to tweet about me. So don't tell me that these people don't know about you and don't know about our work. Especially because it's debunking their fucking shit work. They know who's debunking their shit work. And they don't give a fuck. They're going to pretend like we're not doing it. They know about... You don't think they know about you? Of course they do. They're not that stupid and shitty. They're just bought. They're not stupid. They're just bought.
Fair enough. Fair enough, Jimmy. Fair enough. You're right.
So, and for him to say that they did better reporting on that story than anybody else, that is Dean Baquet flat out lying. That's not a misquote or a misstep or him getting it wrong or forgetting. That's him pushing a lie. He's a liar. And of course, he's the executive super duper editor of the New York bought by billionaires Times. Here comes the next one. This is the funny part. He then says, we're a little tiny bit flat-footed when it came to Mueller report. I mean, that's what happens when a story looks a certain way for 2 years, right? That's amazing. I guess that's like the commander at Pearl Harbor going, we're called a little bit flat-footed. We're a little bit flat-footed. Little bit flat-footed. You guys got destroyed. Every fucking destroyed. You guys are at the bottom of the ocean. We're a little flat-footed. What? He goes on to say, the day Bob Mueller walked off. By the way, let me get back to you on her. Is that the understatement of your life that the New York Times editor, who we already revealed to be a flat-out liar, lying to his own journalists, by the way, his own newsroom, that he would use words, such mealy-mouthed words, that they got a tiny bit flat-footed when it came to Russiagate and Mueller?
You know, he knows somewhere deep down that it's bullshit when he has to go little tiny
bit.
Little tiny bit. Little tiny bit. Little tiny bit.
I think you insulted him a little bit. I think maybe you insulted him a little bit. Maybe a little bit. Now you're going to end up in a trunk, and I'm not digging the hole. So he then goes on to say, the day Bob Mueller walked off that witness stand, two things happened. Our readers who wanted Donald Trump to go away suddenly thought, holy shit, Bob Mueller is not going to do it. And why did those people think that? Because you led them to believe Bob Mueller was going to do it.
Exactly.
It was your horrible shit reporting that led people to think that. That's why your readers thought that. What are you, following your readers? Are they getting their info someplace else? Another newspaper? They're getting it from you, your readers.
Yeah.
That's why your readers thought that, you dumb fuck.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a guy like me can run right through the super duper editor of the New York Pro Every War Times. A guy like me, that's how shitty they are. I can fucking smoke pot and run a fucking line right through their bullshit without even trying.
This is where, Jimmy, this is where the Mueller team and the outlets like the Times who covered it in such an awful way really played everybody, and they played themselves. The Mueller team wrote their indictments in a way that like suggested that there was something untoward going on and illicit. But if you read between the lines, you know, you can see that there was nothing there. It was all bullshit. It was all qualified. It was all subjective. They never actually uncovered anything except for basically crimes that were committed as a result of their investigation. So catching people on petty lies that they then hyped up. And everybody bought into that. So everybody got played. At the New York Times, you know, it was a bit willful because they must have known what was going on, but they went along with it because I guess this was profitable for them, and this was their way to avoid talking about real issues. But, you know, now and this is their way of processing this fact that they played themselves. You know, holy shit, Bob Mueller is not going to do it. Well, no shit. This is what we've been telling everybody for 3 years now, you know, and this is why we had to waste so much time going through all these stupid, dumb details that don't matter anymore. Now, you think anybody cares now about like Konstantin Kalimnik or George Papadopoulos? It's all bullshit. It doesn't matter. The reason we had to talk about it is because people in positions of authority were falsely portraying everything to build up a bullshit narrative. And this is their way now of very in the most weaselly way, as you've been pointing out, of acknowledging that. But of course, without taking any real responsibility.
You don't think people are really concerned about Carter Page or Manafort's or Manafort's tax history? You don't really think people care about that?
Well, that's the funniest thing. It's like this whole thing revolved, you know, as Max Blumenthal, my colleague at the Gray Zone, calls it, is basically the Mueller thing took this pirate ship of freaks in the Trump administration, all these weird characters, and cast them as supervillains in this weird, you know, transcontinental spy thriller. When, you know, Carter Page is like a volunteer on the campaign, never spoke to anybody. He wasn't even paid. Same with George Papadopoulos, all these people, but they were elevated to the starring role in this bullshit thriller, you know? And people like the New York Times, this serious news outlet, very sober and serious, with infinite resources, they played a key role in peddling it. They basically turned into purveyors of fiction, not journalism.
He's got a little bit more to say. Here's my last excerpt from his speech. He said, and Donald Trump got a little emboldened politically after Mueller was a dud on the witness stand. And Donald Trump got a little emboldened politically, I think, because, for obvious reasons.
You think so?
Because, everybody was revealed to be bullshitters. And we couldn't actually stand up to Donald Trump for the right reasons because we actually go along with all the bad shit he's doing. We actually are for wars in Venezuela. We're actually for wars in Iran. Hey, we're actually for demonizing immigrants. That was our play up until Donald Trump made it look bad. They've been demonizing immigrants certainly since Bill Clinton. So here he says, but I think for obvious reasons, and I think that the story changed. You think?
I think.
You think? I thought you were going to lead Donald Trump out of the White House in handcuffs. But the story changed. It did? Really? How did it change? You mean a little tiny bit it changed? Or it changed unbelievably 180 degrees? He says, and I think that story changed. A lot of this, get this, this is what, he says, a lot of the stuff we're talking about started to emerge like 6 or 7 weeks ago. So I'm not sure exactly what he means when he says a lot of the stuff we're talking about started to emerge. Do you mean the stuff that started to, like the stuff that we've been talking about for 3 years at the Jimmy Dore Show and an Aramatay's column at the Nation? Is that what he's talking about? The stuff that we're talking about?
When did it start
that's how I
getting
read
hard?
that as well, is that he's trying to suggest that what was obvious to you and I for 3 years has now only started to emerge 6 or 7 weeks ago, that this whole thing was bullshit.
Look, nobody saw
he
it.
says there, yeah, and he says there, because for obvious reasons, he's talking about Trump getting a little bit emboldened politically. Well, those reasons were obvious to us 3 years ago. And that's why we've been saying, and this is what pisses people off so much, because no one likes to hear that the thing that they're presenting as being the thing that's going to bring down Trump is actually helping Trump. And when you and I pointed that out tirelessly, we got attacked for it. People don't want to hear that. But here's Dean Backett of the New York Times saying the exact same thing. Trump got emboldened politically a lot, actually, not just a lot. And yes, the reasons were obvious, is because his resistance and the media, instead of focusing on his actual policies, mobilizing around that, holding rallies, for example, about Trump's attacks on healthcare, Trump passing the biggest upward transfer of wealth in U.S. history with the tax cut, or the tax heist, as we should call it. Instead of focusing on that, people are focusing on Russian social media trolls and whether or not someone in the Trump camp spoke to someone who might know someone who comes from Russia. Literally, that was a topic of articles in the Times. How many times someone in the Trump camp speaks to someone who is either a Russian or knows someone from Russia? It's the most xenophobic sort of framing I can think of. So yeah, Trump got emboldened politically a lot, and it's because of people like Dean Backett and the New York Times and everybody else who drank the Kool-Aid with them.
So they don't oppose Trump on things because they're actually for. Like, for instance, Trump deregulated Wall Street again. And guess what? They found just enough Democrat votes in the Senate to get it done.
Yeah.
It's amazing, right? Guess what? DACA didn't happen. Democrats rolled over for DACA. The Trump's border bill, guess what? Democrats didn't amend it. They just went along with it. What's the point? That's what I'm saying. They gave Trump $80 billion extra dollars to go do war around the world. The guy who they say is a traitor to our own country, they're letting lead our military? And they're giving him $80 billion more. That's because they're with him. So that's why they can pretend to resist him. And it's resisting. They're resisting a paper tiger, or they're resisting a phony thing. They're resisting a hoax.
Exactly right. Exactly right. it's the perfect way to avoid being a real resistance is to
Yes.
promise people or give people the impression that Trump is going down anyway, as long as we just focus on this and protect Mueller and put our faith in Robert Mueller. And of course, it turns out Robert Mueller doesn't even know the details of his own investigation, and too many people let them get away with it. And it's been annoying, Jimmy. It's been annoying. It's been annoying that so few of us have taken up the responsibility to hold everybody to account, and not to be swayed by this bullshit. At least, though, we're seeing some realization that fantasy is no longer sustainable. I mean, Dean Baquet, in his weaselly way, is pretty much acknowledging that.
Now you know why people get their news from YouTube. Because we do a better job than the New York Times. And to say we do a better job than CNN it's a given. But yeah, we do a better job than the New York Times. So does Aaron Matei. So does the Gray Zone Project. The Matt Blumenthal debunked their bullshit lie about. Anyway, it's just it's not. When he says this is a hard job, it's not hard to do a better job than the New York Times when it comes to stories of importance. It's not hard to do a better job. Well, Aaron, thanks for your time. Anything else you want to say about this unbelievable? Again, the story is going to go under the radar because the people who need to make this story popular are guilty of the exact same thing that Dean Baquet is guilty of. So, of course, they won't make this story popular.
Yeah, and this, what we're calling out with Dean Baquet here extends pretty much to the entire media, including adversarial media, including Democracy Now!, including The Intercept, except for Glenn Greenwald, including colleagues of mine at The Nation. And, it's especially important for the Democrats in Congress who've been pretending to be a real resistance for 3 years while going along with all of Trump's policies, or at least not mounting a very effective resistance to them. I've mentioned this before on your show that there were bigger protests by liberal groups over the firing of Jeff Sessions than there were over Trump's tax cuts, the biggest upward transfer of wealth in U.S. history. And there were protests for Sessions because there was this false belief that with Sessions out that Mueller was no longer protected, and that his job wasn't in jeopardy. When, of course, we know that Trump, never impeded with the investigation, even if he voiced complaints to his associates, and he might have tried to get a couple of them to fire Mueller early on. But by the time Jeff Sessions was fired, this was well into the investigation, and to when it was actually almost over. And liberal groups are protesting for Jeff Sessions' job security rather than against Trump passing a massive upward transfer of wealth from the lower classes to the wealthy. And again, things like Venezuela. Right now, Trump has imposed a new blockade on Venezuela, trying to starve the country into submission. How many Democrats are not only opposing it, but how many Democrats are even talking about it? It doesn't even get acknowledged that John Bolton's openly trying to starve Venezuela by cutting off food and medicine and preventing the country from accessing its own money. Who's even talking about it, in the corporate media and among Democrats? It's like, if they're talking about it, most of them are actually supporting it. Adam Schiff, Chuck Schumer, they're all supporting it.
Yeah, that's again, there is no resistance. There's only a phony resistance. And again, your democracy has already been taken from you. This idea that somehow Bernie Sanders gets elected, things are going to turn. That is an incremental change. So if you want we have a right-wing government. No matter if the Democrats are in power completely, we had a right-wing government when Barack Obama and the Democrats had complete control of government. We had a right-wing government. How do I know? Well, he made the Bush tax cuts permanent. He took us from 2 wars to 7. He made the banks bigger. He opened the Arctic to drilling twice. He cracked the heads of peaceful protesters protesting Wall Street from coast to coast. What kind of a government is that? Is that a lefty government? We got a fucking right-wing healthcare plan anyway. Whether I voted for him or Mitt Romney, I would have got the same goddamn healthcare plan. So that's what I mean when I say we have a right wing. We have a right wing government right now. And what Bernie Sanders is pushing, and I'm for it, it's still incrementalism. It's not a revolution. He is not pushing for a revolution. Believe me.
Jim, let me say.
Go ahead.
If I could say, I do think, though, that Bernie Sanders, and I think you'd agree, does represent a, notable shift from everybody else, right? And I think part of the reason why we had Russiagate was in response to his appeal in 2016, because I think the Democratic Party elite realized that he almost won, and they needed something to tamp down progressive sentiment. And Russiagate helped them do that. It also helped them taint Bernie Sanders because, we saw these stories about Russian bots helping Bernie Sanders and helping Tulsi Gabbard. There's a reason why we saw those stories, because they needed to do everything they could to taint the real progressive challenges to their power. Now, that doesn't mean that Bernie Sanders is perfect. He's obviously not. He's fucked up on a lot of things, but he does represent a notable shift and a notable challenge to the Democratic Party leadership. And I think that's part of the reason why they needed Russiagate, was to help stop his rise and stop his appeal.
No doubt about it. And again, the useful idiots on the left who push Russiagate, I told them at the time, and it's more clear now, but what you were actually doing was sowing your own demise when you push Russiagate, because who do you think they're going to use it against? And of course, they use it against the most lefty politicians there are. They use it against Tulsi. Yeah. They use it against Bernie. They use it against Bernie. Bernie pushed Russiagate, and they still use it again. That's why Bernie doesn't have the brightest of advisors, and never did. And the ones who, if there are smart ones there, they're quiet.
I have no inside track to Bernie's campaign. What I suspect is that I like to believe that Bernie knew it was all bullshit, and Bernie maybe even realized that part of it was directed at him and to stop his appeal. But this is how cynical power works, is it forces people into making these tough decisions. Because if Bernie had been a Russiagate skeptic, if he had voiced a little bit of dissent, then they would have made him the Russiagate they would have made it like Bernie the Putin candidate. They would have made it just constantly him having to answer for his failure to criticize Russia's attack on our democracy. They would have made life miserable for him, even more miserable for him than they already have. So I like to think that Bernie made a tactical decision. I think it was the wrong one. I wish he had the guts to say, you know what, this whole thing is bullshit. Even if Russia did steal the emails, which, by the way, I think is pretty clear now they didn't. But anyway, even if they did steal the emails, that this is not worth focusing all of our energy on, and that blah blah blah. But he didn't do that. He just kind of kept his head down, and he sort of paid lip service to it at incremental points.
It's kind of like what Pete Buttigieg says about being called a socialist. If we do the wrong thing, they're going to call us socialists. If we do the right thing, they're going to call us socialists. So we should just do the right thing. Yeah. And I'm sure I'm paraphrasing. That's not exactly how he says it, but same thing with Bernie. Bernie, if you push Russiagate, they're going to call you a socialist. If you don't push Russiagate, they're going to call you a socialist and a Russian puppet. Yeah. And they're doing that anyway. Yeah. So they're doing it. You push it, they're going to fuck you anyway. You push Venezuela. If you come out and you affirm the pretext for the CIA's invasion of Venezuela, they're going to still call you a Maduro sympathizer because you don't want to invade. So why give them that? You know what I mean? Am I being clear or am I being?
I totally agree. Unfortunately, there's such a tendency on the left is that in order to gain mainstream respectability, you have to affirm the propaganda of the mainstream and affirm the basic tenets of it. So if you're criticizing Israel, like you have to say, oh, I still worship Israel. Israel's still the greatest place in the world, but I just think that it's a little bit off course here. And so you have to basically accept the underlying legitimacy of illegitimate things. And it's too bad seeing Bernie do that with Venezuela, calling Maduro a dictator and all this bullshit. But politics is a different game, and thankfully we're not in it.
And Bernie played it so well last time, he got to endorse Hillary Clinton. Talk about fucking not playing politics right. Jesus Christ. Again, these people aren't smarter than us, Aaron. You think they're smarter than us. They're not smarter than us. These people don't have fucking...
If you guys still have me, I've lost you.
Oh, okay.
But he's smiling and he looks good.
Okay, it froze on you smiling. All right, we'll let you go. Thank you very much. Everybody check out Aaron Matei's new show called Pushback.
I don't think he's really frozen.
Well, his picture is frozen.
I think he's pretending to.
Can you hear us, Aaron? No, he can't even hear us.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
Thanks for having me.
Everybody check out Aaron Matei.
Pushback.
Hey, come see a live Jimmy Dore show September 1st in San Francisco, September 8th in Baltimore, the 16th of September we're in Seattle. Go to jimmydoorecomedy.com for a link for all of our live dates and tickets. Plus, become a Patreon member. Is that how you say it? Patron. Become a subscriber to our Patreon. That's a great way to help support the show. You get hours of bonus material every week, or you can sign up directly over at jimmydorecomedy.com, and you cut out Patreon altogether. Thanks for your support.